There are more than 200 cognitive biases. Knowing and remembering them all is difficult, if not impossible, for most people. It would take you over 15 hours just to read through them once. But what if you could condense all these biases into less than 30 minutes? That is the goal of this video. I will explain the 17 strategies and the 3 main problems that underlie almost all cognitive biases. For this video, I drew inspiration from the incredible work of Buster Benson, who in 2016 attempted to summarize them into 20 strategies and 4 problems. In the video description, you'll find the key changes I made, reducing the original 20 strategies to 17 and the 4 problems to 3. You'll also find links to the websites, sources, and studies I will mention. Let's start with the basics. What on earth are cognitive biases? They are systematic errors in thinking that influence both judgment and decision-making. They are mental shortcuts that the brain uses to quickly process information and make decisions. Why is it important to understand them? Because if we increase our awareness of the decision-making errors we make every day, there's a good chance we can significantly reduce the number of those mistakes. Making fewer mistakes means losing less money, saving more time, avoiding a lot of unnecessary suffering, and preserving important relationships. There are 3 major problems that lead us to rely on cognitive biases. Almost all cognitive biases attempt to solve one or more of these problems. Problem number 1. We live in a world flooded with data and information. Every 24 hours, over 30,000 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube alone. We somehow need to filter all the data we encounter daily. To do this, our brain optimizes, forgets, generalizes, and selects. The real problem arises when we filter out important and useful information. So the first major problem to solve is too much information. There are 7 strategies we use to filter information, and for each strategy, I'll give you an example of a cognitive bias. The first strategy makes us filter information by prioritizing the data that is already stored in our memory. Imagine this situation. You are about to take the practical driving test and you are incredibly nervous. You're nervous because you believe you won't pass the test, not because you haven't practiced enough, but because your mom, dad, and 2 of your best friends all failed on their first attempt. In your mind, it's much more likely that you won't pass, but the statistics don't lie. For example, in Italy, according to a study conducted by M-Up Research in collaboration with Norstat, around 90% of people passed the practical test on their first attempt. So why do you have this irrational belief? Why do you feel you will almost certainly fail the practical test on your first try? This is called the availability heuristic, a bias that explains why people tend to overestimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall similar examples. In your case, you believe you'll fail on your first attempt because the first examples that come to mind of other people taking the driving test are all of those who failed on their first try. The second strategy makes us filter information by giving more importance to unusual or surprising things, or by ignoring information we consider ordinary or obvious. Instead of explaining the von Restorff effect, which describes this strategy quite well, I want you to experience it directly. Read the following list only once. At some point in the video, I will ask you a question, and if you can answer it, it means you've experienced this cognitive bias. The third strategy makes us filter information by giving more importance to things that change rather than those that remain the same. Imagine you're about to buy a new car, a Tesla Model 3. You start doing your research, studying all the features, possible colors, accessories, and you spend hours watching videos on its performance. You do this for an entire month. What will likely happen is that you'll start noticing a lot of Tesla Model 3s on the road, far more than you noticed the month before. This is due to the frequency illusion bias. Once you've started considering buying a Tesla, your brain begins to filter information, placing more importance on what has changed. In this case, your awareness of Teslas. The actual number of Teslas on the road probably hasn't changed from one month to the next. What has changed is how important that car has become to you. The fourth strategy makes us filter information by giving more importance to the information that confirms our existing beliefs. On the contrary, it makes us ignore those that contradict them. Have you ever heard of the three-number test? In 1960, British psychologist Peter Cathcart-Wasson devised an experiment that became famous in the study of deductive reasoning. Participants were shown a sequence of three numbers, such as 2, 4, and 6. Their task was to figure out the rule behind this sequence. To do so, they could suggest other sequences of three numbers and receive immediate feedback on whether the new sequence followed the hidden rule. What's astonishing is that only 20% of participants managed to discover the correct rule. Not because the rule was difficult, even a child could have found it. The reason why 80% of participants got it wrong was due to the confirmation bias. The sequence 2, 4, 6 led most participants to hypothesize that the rule was the next number increases by 2. But this was not the correct rule. The actual rule was any sequence of numbers in ascending order. The mistake made by 80% of participants was to look only for evidence that confirmed their initial hypothesis, rather than exploring other possibilities that might have disproved it. For example, instead of suggesting a sequence like 1, 2, 3 or 0, 10, 20 to see if the rule was simply increasing numbers, many kept proposing sequences like 8, 10, 12 or 14, 16, 18, which confirmed their initial hypothesis of increments of 2. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses while ignoring or minimizing evidence to the contrary. The fifth strategy makes us filter information by noticing the flaws in others more easily than we notice our own. Imagine living in the United States and finding yourself in a room with about 600 people. You're asked a question to which you must respond honestly. Compared to the average American, do you think you have more or fewer biases? What would your answer be? You would probably say fewer. How do I know that? Emily Pronin, a psychology professor at Princeton University, conducted a very similar study to the scenario I've just described. The result of the 600-plus participants, more than 85% believed they had fewer biases than the average American. Only one person thought they had more. Obviously, this result can't be accurate. About 50% of people should have believed they were below average, and about 50% should have thought they were above average. This demonstrates what is called the blind spot bias, which describes the human tendency to easily recognize biases in others while failing to see the impact of biases on oneself. The sixth strategy makes us filter information by modifying and reinforcing certain memories after an event. In a study conducted in 1978 by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus and colleagues, the participants watched a series of slides showing a car accident. In one of the slides, a car was stopped at a stop sign. Later, the participants were asked questions about the details of the accident, and one group was given a misleading question. Instead of asking about the stop sign, the researchers mentioned the red traffic light, thus suggesting a false detail. After this phrase, the participants took a memory test where they had to recall what they had actually seen in the original slides. Many of them, influenced by the misleading question, incorrectly remembered seeing a red light instead of the stop sign that was present in the images. This experiment demonstrated how the insertion of false or misleading information could alter witnesses' real memories, creating false memories with a high degree of certainty. This is a perfect example of how the suggestibility bias can manifest. The memory of an event is contaminated by external information, leading the person to remember a detail that was never actually there. The seventh strategy makes us filter information by ignoring details and forming generalizations based on only the elements we deem important. In 1932, Frederick Bartlett conducted an experiment based on the War of the Ghosts. He asked a group of British participants to read this ancient Native American story. The main characteristic of the War of the Ghosts is that it contained details and themes unfamiliar to Western culture, such as supernatural elements. After the reading, he asked all the participants to recall and retell what they remembered from the original story at varying time intervals. He asked immediately after reading, after a few days, after weeks, and even after months. From this study, Bartlett observed that 1. Culturally unfamiliar details were often omitted or simplified. 2. Elements more consistent with the participant's own culture were emphasized or elaborated. 3. The story became progressively shorter and more stereotyped in subsequent recollections. This study demonstrated the existence of the leveling and sharpening bias, which refers to the cognitive process that leads to reducing or ignoring less relevant details of information or experiences, while highlighting or exaggerating aspects considered more important. Do you remember the list of 15 words I showed you a few minutes ago? How many of those words can you recall? If you only remember 4 or 5, and one of them is flying penguin, then you've fallen into the von Restorff effect, also known as the isolation effect. This cognitive bias explains our tendency to isolate and more easily remember elements that stand out starkly from others. In our case, flying penguin was the only word on the list made up of 2 words and not easily associated with the other 14. Alright, now let's move on to the second major problem that causes us to rely on cognitive biases. Problem number 2. The world is a complex place, extremely complex. There are many things we don't understand. Not understanding things scares us a lot. To feel less afraid, we create stories and patterns that give meaning to what we don't comprehend. A life without meaning is terrifying, so we tend to search for meaning everywhere, even when it doesn't exist. The second problem is the lack of meaning. There are 6 strategies we use to give meaning, and for each strategy, I'll cite a cognitive bias. The first strategy helps us make sense of things by making us believe we know what others are thinking. In some cases, this means we assume they know what we know. In other cases, we assume they're thinking about us as much as we think about ourselves. Have you ever felt like you were the center of attention, feeling uncomfortable and anxious, as if all eyes were on you, even in mundane situations? While working out at the gym, during a business meeting, or simply walking down the street with a new outfit or different hairstyle. This feeling might be due to the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias that leads us to overestimate how much others focus on us. In other words, it seems as if every little detail of our lives is under a magnifying glass, when in reality, most people are too busy thinking about themselves to notice us. If you've ever felt like you were under a microscope, constantly being judged by others, believe me, you're not alone. I've created a course to help people like you. In this course, I delve into effects such as the spotlight effect and the cognitive distortion known as mind reading, which leads us to believe we know what others are thinking. You'll learn how to free yourself from the fear of judgment from others. You'll understand how to recognize when you're experiencing anxiety and the difference between normal worries and an actual social anxiety disorder. You'll learn what I believe are the best techniques and strategies for managing this type of anxiety in just a few minutes, and in some cases, in a few seconds. Oh, by the way, the course is completely free. You can find the link with all the information in the description. Now, back to us. The second strategy helps us make sense of things by finding stories and patterns, even when we have scattered or incomplete data. In 1967, 2 American psychologists, Lauren J. Chapman and Gene P. Chapman, conducted an experiment. They presented a group of university students with a series of drawings supposedly made by imaginary psychiatric patients. Each drawing was accompanied by a fictional psychiatric diagnosis. However, the students didn't know that both the drawings and the diagnoses were invented, and there was no real correlation between the features of the drawings and the diagnoses provided. They had been paired randomly. The participants were asked to examine these drawings and the associated diagnoses, and then to identify which characteristics of the drawings were associated with specific diagnoses. These illusory associations tended to align with stereotypical or intuitive beliefs about mental illness. For example, many participants reported noticing that patients diagnosed as paranoid tended to draw particularly large or detailed eyes, even though this correlation didn't actually exist in the data presented. Similarly, participants reported other associations such as large heads for patients with concerns about intelligence or muscular figures for patients with concerns about masculinity. This experiment demonstrated that people tend to perceive relationships or correlations between variables even when these objectively do not exist. This phenomenon is known as the illusory correlation bias. The third strategy helps us make sense of things by filling in missing information with stereotypes and generalizations based on prior knowledge. This process allows us to fill gaps with plausible assumptions, even if we later forget which parts were based on reality and which were based on speculation. In 1976, Duncan Burt conducted a study with 96 white white university students, showing them two types of films. In one, a white student was attacking a black student. In the other, the exact opposite occurred. A black student was attacking a white student. The act of aggression was identical in both videos. Afterward, participants were asked to explain the reasons for the violence, and these were the results. When the aggressor was black, the violence was attributed to internal traits, such as personality or the nature of the group, with the assumption that black people are inherently violent. Conversely, when the aggressor was white, the violence was often justified by external factors, such as stress or provocation. This study, along with many others that followed, demonstrated the existence of a cognitive bias known as the ultimate attribution error. This bias shows how people tend to attribute the causes of behaviors differently depending on whether the actions were carried out by members of their own group or by members of other groups. The fourth strategy helps us make sense of things by making us believe that the things and people we know or like are better than those we don't know or dislike. Have you ever heard of Lance Armstrong? He was considered a national hero and a source of inspiration for many. He won 7 consecutive Tour de France titles. No one in the world has ever been able to replicate such an achievement. In addition, Armstrong also survived cancer and founded the Live Strong Foundation, a charity dedicated to fighting cancer, which raised millions of dollars. Armstrong's public image was that of an undisputed champion, a courageous survivor, and a generous philanthropist. This positive perception created a powerful halo effect around him. However, in 2012, he was accused of doping. Many of his supporters initially refused to believe the allegations precisely because of the halo effect generated by his positive public image. When Armstrong finally admitted in 2013 to using performance-enhancing drugs throughout his career, the revelation shocked the public. Many people felt betrayed and struggled to believe that someone who seemed to embody such positive values could have deceived the world for so long. This case clearly demonstrates how the halo effect can influence people's judgment. Armstrong's reputation as a successful athlete and philanthropist had created such a positive image that many couldn't conceive of his involvement in illicit activities. In fact, the halo effect distorts the perception of one trait of a person or thing, influencing the evaluation of their other traits. Other examples of the halo effect include judging someone as intelligent because they are physically attractive, considering an expert in one field to be competent in all areas, trusting a celebrity's opinion on topics they are not an expert. The fifth strategy helps us make sense of things by simplifying probabilities and numbers. In 2008, most people, including financial analysts and large institutional investors, were convinced that the housing market would continue to grow as it had in previous years. They ignored alarming signs, such as granting 3, 4, or even 5 multi-million-dollar mortgages to strippers who couldn't afford them. They overlooked this and many other red flags because they believed that the growth and the prevailing situation were the new normal, destined to last forever. In hindsight, even after the release of the film The Big Short, it seemed obvious that this situation couldn't continue, and yet almost no one foresaw the impending disaster. But why? There are several reasons, but one that played a crucial role is the normalcy bias. This bias describes people's tendency to believe that things will continue to function in the future as they have in the past, thereby underestimating the likelihood of negative or catastrophic events. People tend to perceive the current situation as the norm, rejecting the idea that something unexpected could happen. The sixth strategy helps us make sense of things by projecting our present mindset and assumptions into the past or future. Do you think the quality of a decision depends on its outcome? Obviously, the answer is no. Let me give you an example. Imagine taking all the money you have in the bank and going to a casino. Once there, you bet everything on red 23. The ball actually lands on 23, earning you 36 times your savings. If you had bet $20,000, you would now have $720,000. Betting all your savings is a stupid decision. Even if by sheer luck you were to win, this wouldn't make the decision any less stupid. It just makes you very lucky. This was a fairly obvious example. But what happens when the situation isn't so clear? In a 1988 study, Barron and Hershey created a series of hypothetical scenarios in which a doctor had to decide whether to perform a risky operation to save a patient's life. In one scenario, the operation succeeded, while in the other, it failed. The participants in the study had to evaluate the quality of the doctor's decision to proceed with the surgery. Despite the fact that in both cases the doctor made the same same decision based on the same information when the operation failed, participants tended to judge the decision negatively. This was due to outcome bias, which describes the tendency to judge the quality of a decision solely based on the final result rather than on the processes and information available at the time the decision was made. Finally, we've arrived at the third major problem that leads us to rely on cognitive biases. Problem number 3. As we've seen, there is one resource in our world that is virtually infinite: information. On the other hand, there is another resource that is finite and very scarce: our time. Since our time is limited, we must by necessity make quick decisions. Quick decisions often lead to overlooking important factors and jumping to conclusions that may be incorrect. The third problem is that time is limited, but we still need to act. There are 4 strategies we use to act quickly. For each strategy, I'll cite a cognitive bias. The first strategy helps us act more quickly by making us more confident in our abilities. In 1977, Lichtenstein and Fischoff published an interesting study. In this study, participants were asked to answer a series of general knowledge questions, some of which were more difficult and others easier. The researchers then asked the participants to estimate the likelihood that their answers were correct. The results were as follows. The participants overestimated their chances of having answered the difficult questions correctly, believing their answers were much more accurate than they actually were. Conversely, when it came to the easy questions, the exact opposite occurred. Participants tended to underestimate the quality of their answers, displaying a lack of confidence that was disproportionate to their actual competence. This tendency is explained by the hard-easy effect, which illustrates how people tend to be overly confident when facing complex tasks and lack confidence in their abilities when the tasks are relatively easy. The second strategy helps us act more quickly by making us favor things that are immediate and easy to understand. Imagine the following offer. A. You receive $100 immediately, directly into your bank account. B. You receive $105 in your bank account in 1 month. Rationally, waiting a month to receive $105 is clearly the better option. By waiting, you'll earn 5% more in just a single month. However, many people tend to choose option A, preferring the immediate $100. Now, let me present the same offer, slightly modified. A. You receive $100 in 5 years and 8 months. B. You receive $105 in 5 years and 9 months. In this second case, most people would tend to choose option B, preferring to wait an additional month to gain the extra $5. But if you think about it, in both cases, you are waiting an extra month to get $5. So why is there a difference in choice? The change in decision is due to a bias known as hyperbolic discounting. This bias causes people to prefer immediate rewards over larger rewards in the future, disproportionately devaluing rewards that are further away in time. In practice, people tend to give greater value to immediate rewards than to future ones, even when, rationally, waiting would be the better choice. In the example we just discussed, the key difference isn't the 1 month of waiting, but the fact that in the first scenario, the choice is between having the money immediately or in the future. In the second scenario, immediate gratification is absent. Therefore, the decision becomes choosing between money in the distant future or more money in the distant future. The third strategy helps us act more quickly by motivating us to finish what we've started, giving more value to something we've already invested time and energy into. Would you ever pay 63% over the actual price for an identical item? It sounds absurd, but believe me, the answer is yes. In 2011, Norton and colleagues conducted a study on IKEA furniture. After recruiting participants, some assembled the furniture themselves, while others were given pre-assembled versions. After the assembly, participants were asked to estimate the value of the furniture they had created or received. What they found was that people were willing to pay 63% more for the furniture they had assembled themselves. This is due to the IKEA effect, a cognitive bias that leads us to attribute disproportionate value to products we have partially created because we have invested time and energy into them. The fourth strategy helps us act more quickly by preferring options that seem simple or have more complete information compared to those that are ambiguous and complex, even when doing the more complex thing is more important. There is a cognitive bias called the rhyme as reason effect. In a study conducted by McGlone and Tofik-Bosch in 2000, researchers asked a group of participants to judge which statements they thought were more accurate and true. The statements were presented in pairs. The meaning of the statements was practically identical, but one of them rhymed, and the other did not. For example, what sobriety conceals, alcohol unmasks. What sobriety conceals, alcohol reveals. Now, I don't know about you, but in my opinion, both phrases mean exactly the same thing. The surprising thing about this study was that participants rated the rhyming statements as more accurate and truthful compared to those that didn't rhyme, even though the content was essentially the same. The likely reason lies in our brains. It is much easier for the brain to remember rhyming phrases compared to those without. If you're interested in topics like systematic thinking errors and decision-making processes, I'm sure you'll also appreciate the video where I explain all the cognitive distortions we can have. I'll leave the link in the description.